Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to a new meeting of the Finance Network series in Conversation, exploring the philosophy of money and finance. This ongoing series brings together a range of interviews with leading thinkers at the intersection of philosophy, finance, and economics. And today we are delighted to welcome Joshua Preiss from the Department of Public Policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who will be interviewed by Andrew Norton from Gothenburg University. Joshua is an especially fitting guest of our series, given his important work that explores the intersection of ethics, economics, and public policy with a focus on justice, freedom, and well-being in democratic society. He's also the author of Just Work for All, which is a major contribution to contemporary debates on economic justice. And so thank you very much, Josh and Andrew, for accepting our invitation. Today's interview is titled Freedom and Financial Market Reform, and is inspired by a chapter authored by Joshua in the recently published volume, The Philosophy of Money and Finance, edited by Jürgen Sandberg and Lisa Varensky, and published by Oxford University Press. Following the interview, we will open the floor for discussion as usual. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand using the Zoom menu, and we will manage the queue. And that's all from me for now, and let's begin the interview. Enjoy.
Okay, and I guess that's over to me. So, firstly, thank you, Emiliano, Lisa, and Joachim in absentia for arranging these talks, and Joshua, of course, for joining us. I want to pick up on something there before I get into my questions, just following up on Emiliano's introduction to you. One of the things that strikes me about your background is your methodology, right? It's truly multidisciplinary, very philosophy combined with economics, combined with politics, very much in the round, which I very much appreciate. So moving on. So your chapter, Freedom and Financial Market Reform, just in a nutshell, for those who are tuning in, it makes the case that real freedom depends on the accountability of financial market institutions, and that a failure to recognize this leads to financial market reforms that create concentrations of power that are the antithesis of freedom, right? Creates potential for domination. So let me start straight into some of these questions then. So firstly, this is a question about motivation, right? So how did you come to this question? Either, in terms of your personal journey. I'm always, as someone who also likes to combine an interest with the finance sector and what's going on there with philosophy, how did you get there? And in terms of the philosophical puzzle that you're choosing to address in this particular paper, how did you get there? What's the motivation?
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. And again, thanks, Emiliano, Lisa, Joachim, everyone. It's an amazing series. I'm very proud to be a part of it and thrilled to be a part of it. Hope to equip myself as well as some of the other speakers in response to Andrew's questions and your all's. So speaking of me, what made me interested in this? Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, this is in a way a sequel to a paper I wrote earlier, which I titled "Did We Trade Freedom for Credit?" um, where I had argued that the answer is in many ways yes, that wealthy democracies or their leaders had increasingly traded freedom for credit. And to a certain extent, when I write about trade, and I think these things are very connected, global value chains or global wealth chains, financial flows, financial regulation, deregulation plays a central role in shaping trade structures, both of which come together to shape a bunch of the other stuff I write about, including Just Work for All, which is the institutions that structure labor markets in societies. So these things are deeply connected. So part of the sort of biographical explanation is simply that they're connected. So I wanted to learn more about this part of the connection. Another sense is I think following the great financial crisis, but for me, really, it took a while to kind of permeate. We're talking now 2016, 2017, when I was on my first sabbatical, and I was spending the year in Providence. I started to become interested in these things, and part of the reason my interest, I think, is because I increasingly saw finance, financial markets, the role of finance in the economy, the financialization of what might have been called the productive economy, is playing this really profound role in contemporary political economy, playing this big role. If we're philosophers and we think about justice as being the first virtue of social institutions, the institutions that were structuring people's lives, their opportunities, what they needed to do to meet their basic needs or accomplish their dreams was very much being driven by finance and financial markets. The political response to transformations in the economy, sort of really percolated the great financial crisis. This was driving political transformations, I felt, and throughout many democratic societies, which I also talk about in the last book. And philosophers weren't talking about it hardly at all. Like these are just profoundly influential, important things, which structure basically things that political philosophers basically take as their central, like what they're talking about: justice, how we relate to others, whether we can accomplish our ends, and so on and so forth. And it was almost as though its relative importance was inversely related to the amount we talked about it as philosophers. And so I wanted to learn as much as I could, and so instead of taking what a philosopher might do on this, which is to come up with, and I do have a little toy thought experiment, of course, but instead of just saying like, okay, well, let's do this thought experiment and tease something out, I tried to learn as much as I could about what was going on. And when I learned what was going on, I started to say like, okay, well, these discourses are not necessarily addressing things that I think are really important, not so much to narrow questions of financial market stability, but rather to the role of finance in society and how it interacts with these other things. So then that's when I sort of started going on, and it dovetails nicely with, for me, I think it's a kind of a natural companion to talking about freedom in markets generally, as well. So I think that's my sort of biographical answer. But
Yeah, no, cool.
and the more you learn with this, the more I learn about this, the more I learn what I don't know, but that's also exciting too. So.
Sure. I mean, whenever you step into the empirical like that, there's always a wealth of stuff to get to grips
Yeah.
with. I mean, you're right. There was a load of material, a load of interest in the moral dimension of the global economic crisis and the counter, but way less in terms of its significance in political terms. I think that's absolutely fair. Let's get into some of the meat of your paper. So, over the course of your paper, you highlight that financial reform is debated along a number of axes, right? You talk about the axis that's along the stability of the financial system. You've got the axis that's focused on individual freedom. Now, your main focus is on this freedom axis. So, how has the concept of freedom generally been handled in financial market reform in the past?
Well, I mean, I guess the short answer, it hasn't much at all,
Yeah.
frankly. So these discourses on financial markets and financial market reforms that I've aware of, that I've followed, have largely focused on a kind of like what is seen as a tension between growth and stability, right? So how do you grow, develop financial markets, or recognize the importance of financial market development to economic growth? How do you not get in the way of that, while also keeping the system stable, not having these shocks, right? And so there's a lot of discourse like playing those two off each other or just independently talking about that. And there's been some discourse on the distributive impact. I think when Andrew Haldane even and many others, when they started to see the impact of, various responses to the great financial crisis, distributive impact, they started to sort of own up to that distributive impact. But even then, not so much talking about freedom. And when freedom was discussed and where it is discussed, where I found it, one was in these sort of, if you will, free market indexes that are meant to measure economic freedom. For example, the Economic Freedom of the World Index, sponsored by Cato and the Fraser Institute of Canada and like 80 something other think tanks, which is not just their own thing, but gets cited in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and things like that. It's an influential artifact. But also in various like concrete debates and what we might think of as the era of liberalization of financial markets. from the late 70s through the late 2000s. There are a lot of people would say, well, and this, of course, freedom is good. And of course, freedom is good. And we know that freedom leads to growth and that people want it. So when has freedom let us down? Let's do freedom. And this freedom lens was usually in both of these discourses sort of understood freedom to be fundamentally as a kind of almost opposition to government, right? It's a kind of like freedom begins where government ends. And that there was a kind of opposition between governmental involvement in the economy, governmental regulation, even in democratic societies, and the market, such that, like, for a lot of these discourses, the question wasn't, does this regulation further or hinder freedom, or does this regulation, or does this involvement and investment hinder or hurt free or further freedom, but rather that if governments were doing it at all, it was taken as part is by definition a threat to freedom. And so I felt like that was misguided. And so what was there was missing things about freedom, largely treating it as an instrument to growth, understood in a kind of narrow way, I felt. But then much of it wasn't talking about freedom at all. It's just like on the purview um, of the discourses. So yeah. So then I was trying to for what whatever the value it is, my interventions into this discourse are sort of like, no, really, actually, freedom matters, but also here's maybe how we ought to think about freedom. And not just think about it from one particular narrow philosophical school. And I think, Andrew, you probably asked me about this in a bit, but from a variety of different perspectives can have some overlap practically when thinking about freedom and markets. Yeah.
Cool. Now, the main thrust of your argument, while talking about freedom, is that the way freedom is generally handled in debates on financial market reform misses something really important, and that is accountability, right? So, you know, from my perspective, I mean, I read this, and from my perspective, financial market reformers talk about accountability a lot. Think about all the debates around Dodd-Frank after the global economic crisis, right? So talking about accountability a lot. So what exactly is this link between freedom and accountability? Could you provide an illustration of the specific kind of link that you're trying to convey here? And in what way are you saying that accountability is being neglected in these debates on financial market reform?
Yeah, it's good. I mean, I look back, I should go back through some of these discourses, but I hear a lot more about transparency than accountability. And I think those are related, but I don't think they're quite the same thing in the sense of how I'm using it. So, for example, transparency can often take the form of more regulation, more documentation of what's going on, right? But accountability means something else, right? So, or like that can be central to accountability. And then I can give a kind of little example here in a bit. But um, one, there's a tendency in that discourse to want more transparency, to want more, if you will, accountability like things, to then just demand more and more regulation, more and more principles on the books to kind of deal with that. There's a kind of, in other words, complexity built into it. In fact, when you build so much complexity into it, a sort of functional from a kind of like politics perspective, is that it sort of inevitably leads to outsourcing of that regulation itself. It inevitably leads to a kind of revolving door between financial firms and governments who are doing the regulating, with the financial firms paying substantially better than the governments doing the regulating, right? Because it seems to increasingly rely upon a set of super technical knowledge in order to actually hold people accountable. This complexity also kind of has a tendency to sort of privilege larger firms, right? The burdens of regulation are more easily handled if you have a larger scale enterprise, right? So you can actually functionally, if you approach accountability not by thinking, is what I will say, in terms of power and accessibility of the democratic public, but in terms of more regulation and more documentation, you can actually further concentrate economic power by calling for more transparency, if that makes sense, is part of the structure. And I think from what I read of the finance, the empirical literature on this and some of the modeling on this is precisely what happens when responding to regulation. Um, One thing, just to give you sort of maybe to answer the example question, and I'll talk about what might be even more important than the complexity point. Um, so I give this example in the paper. And like most thought experiments, like most models, it's an abstraction. It's a simplification meant to zero in on something. But I said, imagine a primitive economy of independent worker farmers, basically a primitive agrarian society, right? They each individually own their own land. It's a broadly democratic society that's structured. They make the rules of the game themselves, um, and they follow them, and so on and so forth. And then imagine that some either one small segment of this group or an invader sort of takes over and restructures the society, seizes the property of these people, breaks it into three giant farms, and then offers them a wage on this section, on this economy, right? Now, in this new economy, if you look at, say, like how, for example, the economic freedom of the world defines freedom, this second economy is at least, if not more, free than the first one, right? No one's forced to work for a particular employer or a particular wage. There's mobility between them. There's more finance, there's more development in a certain set of thing, and I could go on and on. But there's a fundamental way in which they're less free, which is that the rules of the game that structured their choices are less, if or just almost completely unaccountable. I mean, there's accountability in an authoritarian regime too, but they're less accountable than they were, such that even if they were wealthier, they would be less free in that sense. In part because the society would also function to concentrate power in those things. And I think one of the fundamental, at least in my reading of and one of the things that's gone if you either ignore freedom in these debates or you treat freedom as the absence of government interference or something like that, is you can kind of ignore the impact of financial development, these financialization of the economy on power, right? And so one of my concerns, what I was getting in here is this sense that decades worth of financial market reform combined with technological change, combined with development within the industry itself, has functioned to increasingly concentrate economic and political power within those best suited to benefit from this transformation, right? Um, Including banks which are increasingly too big to fail and have a certain structural power, including non-bank finance-like entities, right? Now, these this concentration of power through these trends is not through this development is not fundamentally about stability or growth in the way it's typically modeled in these debates when they're having debates about stability and growth. But this concentration of power does play a huge role in figuring in determining the distribution or the inclusiveness of growth that follows in the economy as a result. And two, it plays a big role in determining when there is instability, whose assets get priority, right? So this concentration of power undermines accountability in this kind of quasi-Republican sense, but not in a way that only philosophical Republicans can get at. And these reforms, when they were talking about their reforms, rarely, if ever, in my view, or in my notice, really address that as a central issue, except for insofar as large financial firms would be too big of a threat to the system. Expose that right there. So the role in the economy, and as a general, and then I'll sort of stop talking and let you ask the next question. But and I think it's the public philosophy. I mean, I think for several decades, this sort of public philosophy and the way that these discourses, public philosophy, not meaning philosophers intervening in the public, but the way people thought about freedom and market, the way people thought about the ends of economic policy and how that translated into financial market reforms, had a tendency to, well, not only not discourage, but in effect, and sort of encourage things which, from a freedom as accountability perspective, are bad. It would in a way encourage regulatory and tax arbitrage. It would, in a way, function to rather than sort of trying to backstop full economy in the economy, it would function to backstop highly concentrated asset holders, which of course provides more incentive for people with those assets to invest them in a particular sort of way. And it creates this loop, right? And a lot of that stuff was just completely lacking or often lacking in these discourses, including in economic discourses on finance. So
Yeah.
that's
We,
enough, probably. I could go on and on because now I'm
all right.
threatening to
No,
talk the rest of my what I work on. But so I'm always at danger of doing that. But I'll stop. Go ahead, Andrew.
it's good. It's good value, and you reference you reference financialization a couple of times there, and you make great use of the financialization thesis repeatedly in the chapter. In some places, I think in a very interesting way. I want to pick up on something you were just talking about there. You were saying that the conception that the issue with accountability is something that you don't have to be a neo-Republican, have a neo-Republican conception of freedom to have a problem with this. So I want to build on that. You often give the impression in the text that you think those who like to talk about freedom in the sense of non-interference, and those who like to talk about freedom in terms of non-domination, should be able to find common ground on this question of the need to foster accountability. So could you elaborate on precisely how you envisage this common ground?
Well, it's the concentrations of power, right? The common ground is that both see concentrations of power as a fundamental threat to freedom. For Republicans, like these concentrations of power are sort of just what unfreedom means, right? Just it'd be domination sort of just is to a certain extent concentrations of power. Uh, but for libertarians, um, they'll recognize empirically that concentrations of power make it far more likely for people to be coerced or to be interfered with, right? So they also have a similar reason to value accountability again, and accountability at least in this concentrations of power sense. But I could go a little further than that as well. I mean, even Milton Friedman, for example, who played a central role in the sort of founding of this economic freedom of the world index. Um, famously said that concentrations of power in every form are a fundamental threat to freedom. I think the reason why it's useful to talk in terms of accountability, one of the many reasons I think it's useful to do that, is that it can help us avoid making a kind of mistake from that sort of baseline thesis, which is to have something that kind of goes like this. Concentrations of power are the fundamental threat to freedom. Government agencies, governments represent the greatest concentrations of power. Therefore, whatever limits or takes away power or takes away say from governments and government agencies is a safeguard of freedom.
Yeah.
Right. And my main concern with that, and I talk about this a bit in this paper, but a bunch in lots of other things, um, is that gosh, how best to put it? Well, I mean, if your efforts to bring about small government effectively euthanize forms of accountability, either the ability of democratically of workers and citizens to hold their democratic leaders accountable when they're making structural choices about how economics institutions are structured, um, or insofar as you're further concentrating power as a result of that. I mean, you're sort of learning the exact, I think, wrong lesson from the concentrations of power point, right? Which is not that, and I think that wrong lesson kind of stems from another sort of bugaboo, which makes itself into a lot of things I write about, which is this tendency, again, to see markets and governments and as a kind of threat of opposition. So if you see the question as being fundamentally about markets versus governments, even if you don't understand freedom just in terms of markets, you might be inclined to say, well, government's the biggest Bahama Jamma here, so whatever we can do to limit them, right? But when you limit the accountability of government leaders, when you make it so that it's very difficult for even well-meaning democratic leaders to either address the concentrations of power, right? Because power is power, right? They have a bigger say, or to even hold or even track the capital as it flows and so on and so forth. When you do this structurally, you're sort of engendering crony capitalism rather than trying to protect against it, is my view. And that's why I think they both have a reason to see concentrations of power as a threat. But I think you also, if once you recognize that the rules of the game of markets don't like fall from the sky according to textbook models of a perfect competition, right? They're the subject of ongoing contestation. So if your reforms increasingly concentrate political and economic power into the hands of relatively small asset holders, then it stands to reason that your society over time is going to adopt laws and institutions that principally benefit those asset holders. Now, a certain public choice theorist could say, like, this is why we didn't want government involved all along. But really, it's a natural response to ceding accountability, reform after reform, decade after decade, over the course of the evolution of the economy. So that's my main argument here. So there's a common ground, but it's a critical common ground in the sense that I think some of the people I think I share common ground with maybe ought to think about the policy implications and the political implications of that common ground a little bit differently.
Yeah. Okay. Now, in that, you started going into some of the sort of serious consequences that can arise from this sort of approach. So maybe I should park. I was going to ask you about how bad it can get. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to what you've said. But if not, I can move on to what I want to tackle next.
Well, I think it can get pretty bad. I mean, again, this is, threatening to talk not just about this individual paper, but how it links to other things. But I think a lot of the world right now is experiencing, to a certain extent, a sense of this belief that institutions are not structured over a wealthy democratic world is experiencing a sort of belief that these institutions, one, are concentrate that the concentrations of power are leading to the institutions to be not less reflecting their values and interests. And the great financial crisis, as I said, was like there's this small library of works in politics, political economy, sociology that talks about the link between these things. And my sort of last book, and to a certain extent, the one I'm just finishing, are sort of like the philosophically tinged versions of that. But yeah, like this economy going in this way, privileging asset holders, and this can function also to interact with various things in the housing market, of course, which I don't really explore in this paper, but I do in the book. These are big political drivers. They're big political drivers of the rise of authoritarian populists. They're big political drivers, and particularly in the American context, and the declining faith in liberal democratic institutions, right? Trump, I think, is a symptom of this loss, right? So the stakes are pretty bad. I mean, we haven't really had liberal democracy all that long in the grand scheme of humanity. I mean, even in Europe, a consolidated liberal democracy was mostly like a post-World War II phenomenon. And so, yeah, I think the consequences, and this is not narrowly financial market reform, but if you don't think about capital flows, you don't think about financial markets, you don't think about these things with this lens in mind, it's going to be hard to do the rest. You don't think about investment, you don't think about money creation and all these things with this set of values in mind. So yeah, the I guess the bad could be like no more democracy. I don't want to be just like that all follows from what I argued in this paper. But yeah, I think it get pretty bad. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, private power is under theorized. In political philosophy, I think that's fair, and the implications of that is fair. Now, you're painting a pretty bleak picture, right? Sort of really bleak, and you described earlier this kind of sort of vicious circle, this vicious cycle, right? It's sort of descending,
Yeah.
descending, descending, right? We got this death spiral, but you do go on to consider, how financial market reform should look like if it's going to take seriously the value of freedom from domination and not simply a non-interference view of freedom. So what is the key? Is it a particular methodology? Is it a particular goal? What is it? What needs to change about financial market reform?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I look at, or rather really more name and point to other people who have written about various kinds of reforms that might sort of fit the bill. And I talk about them a little bit in the paper. I talk about them a little bit more in some other things I work on. But I think it is fundamentally less a call for a particular reform than a methodology or an orientation, or if you will, a public philosophy, right? So when we're thinking about or having debates about what the ends of economic policy is in general, including all the things which interact with capital F finance. And again, how do you draw a distinction between what's finance and not? Some people don't want to draw any distinction. Some people want to draw it very narrow. And I don't really care to get involved in that sort of discussion right now. But when you draw these sort of distinctions, when you get into these discussions, I think the fundamental sort of orientation or methodology should be simply say, well, when I'm passing a reform, right, the question, or when I'm considering a reform, or when I'm not doing a reform, right, I'm thinking about what reform should be done. How should these markets and these institutions be structured? It's the question should always be, how does this impact concentrations of political and economic power? Does this help ordinary workers and citizens hold their leaders accountable, or does it more obscure their ability to hold their leaders accountable? Whether through complexity, whether through something else. And that a freedom-centered, if you will, cost-benefit analysis in finance or in trade has to center on those questions. Right? And you can't answer those questions just by reasoning back from a model of perfectly competitive markets or perfectly domination-free markets for that matter, right? I mean, the fact that perfectly competitive markets are domination-free doesn't mean that a reform that makes a market more competitive or more developed will mean there'll be less domination, right? And I think so. I think one of the fundamental sort of like challenges, and anybody who thinks power is important and thinks that there is a vicious circle of power to, I don't know, injustice, unfreedom, however you want to think about it, is always going to face like a fundamental problem. Like, how do you break that cycle? I think you get moments of breaking that cycle. Um, I think the election of Trump the first time and Brexit gave us some political moments for breaking that cycle. I think various things that I might recommend were adopted or talked about more in response to that. But then the COVID shock happened and subsequent inflation, and then so like the anti-incumbency backlash sort of swamped all of those discussions for a little while. But I think there's going to be there are and have been and there will be political moments where people are going to start to recenter these things. I think we're still in one now, but we'll see. So I guess so as a methodology, yeah, that's the question. Like how including investment, right? I mean, so there's an implication here that more publicly coordinated access, credit and investment might be a central way of thinking about it. Capital controls might be a central way or a way of thinking about it. But also, just making finance more boring might be a way of thinking about it. But whatever you think, the link is always like, okay, does this reform or does this drift, further or hinder concentrations of power? And then if the power is concentrated reasonably well, and that could be theoretically, it could be with JP Morgan Chase, right? You could theoretically have JP Morgan Chase be held accountable to citizens, right? But usually governments are much more easily, we have a structure for holding concentrations of power in government more accountable, right? So if it is concentrated in government, then how do we hold the leaders accountable? And what do the leaders think about what their job is, I guess, too. But that's probably enough answer to that. But it's definitely a methodology. It's an orientation. You could think I could, I'm talking too much, but I could you could even imagine a way of breaking this down into metrics, not unlike like say capabilities approach metrics where you can't measure capabilities, but if you can get data that's flourishing that's related to that, you probably do something with that from freedom. But now you're going to ask me a follow-up about that, and I don't have a good answer. So never mind, forget I said that. Thanks.
I'll hold off on that, but we'll see what comes up in the Q&A. So, Josh, thanks. Thank you very much for setting out your argument so clearly. I'm now going to pass back to Emiliano, who's going to take forward the Q&A.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks
Andrew.
very much.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you very much indeed, Joshua and Andrew, for this rich and thought-provoking interview. So we can now open the debate. To ask a question, please raise your virtual hand in the Zoom menu, and we'll manage the queue. Okay, I see Rob Mesh. Thank you, Rob, for being there with us.
Thank you, and thanks, Felisa, for inviting me. And I'm now associated with the Gabelli School of Philosophy. My discipline's philosophy, but I spent 27 years in financial services. And I have a question. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'll just start with one. I'm not sure what your definition is of accountability.
Yeah.
Because one thing for certain in Dodd-Frank was that it was an attempt to create accountability through certifications, through withholding of compensation, and through very aggressive law enforcement of firms. So both on an individual and on an industry level, on an entity level, the government was attempting to create accountability in ways it never had before, and it was somewhat successful. You see the
Mhm.
same thing in England with the FCA, where I spent 4 years in England and doing financial work there, and it makes a big difference. But I don't think that's the kind of accountability you're talking about. You mentioned at the end accountability to the public, accountability sort of unmediated to the public as opposed to through regulators who are acting in the public interest. So my question is, I don't know what you mean by accountability. What do you mean by accountability, and why don't we have it just maybe not executed as well as you'd like to see it?
Well, first of all, yeah, it's not an either or, and I don't think I mentioned this in this, but like I think there are various ways to see Dodd-Frank as a major step forward for some of these things, for sure. In a step forward in terms of accountability, now I talk about in the paper a little bit, incite some people who are skeptical of it was enough of a step forward. So there is that there. But since I've written the paper, I've increasingly seen its benefits as being a little bit bigger than I had before. So I'm sort of, Rob, I'm sort of with you on that in the maybe not as good as it could be, but a step forward way. I mean, it seems to have structured the economy in a way that's mitigated some forms of lack of accountability, including the too big to fail institutions. It seems to work reasonably well relative to the pre-existing structure from a stability perspective. And of course, stability is important because when you have inequalities of power and instability or crises happen, those crises, the great financial crises anyway, manage to more concentrate resources rather than less over time. Right. So stability is important over time to these things. It's also important to someone's sense that they're free, just in the sense of like their lives are somewhat in their control, right? That they can plan for the future. Like financial instability is a concern for that. Um, but I do sometimes wonder, and I do think the point is not that there wasn't steps forward, but rather that it in some ways is not trying to address some of the sort of more, well, I don't know if I say more fun, it's not trying to address some fundamental issues, right? It's focused very narrowly, or comparatively narrowly, on making banks not do things which are bad in these ways, and that therefore we can keep tabs that they won't do things that are bad in these ways, right? It's not really, to a certain extent, tackling concentrations of power. In fact, and you might disagree with me on this, or disagree with those who I find compelling on this, but the post Dodd-Frank financial situation has been further consolidation rather than breaking up of larger banks. Increasing sort of like sense in which happened with Citizens Valley Bank, that the bigger you are, the better off you are, and that the financial markets continue to be structured such that those are bigger is better, right? Concentrations, right? It didn't really do anything to address capital flows in a certain sort of way that I'm aware of. It didn't really, it didn't really, it still kind of leaned into a kind of sort of, I mean, I think the complexity itself, and this is something I should revisit, but the complexity itself probably played a role in whether and to what extent these institutions remained accountable. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's the simplest answer. In terms of accountability itself, I have a little spiel on it in the paper, but it's most of well, I use it as kind of a negation, commonsensical view rather than like a necessary and sufficient conditions. Like you're not accountable. States are not accountable to citizens, or the institutions that govern the market are not accountable to those structured by their institutions if they meet A, B, and C. I don't say that, but rather I say that certain sorts of phenomenon on a variety of views of accountability are reasonably seen as threats to accountability. And that is concentrations of power, that is complexity, that is the ability of even democratic leaders to really know what the institutions they're passing, what the laws they're passing are, how to interpret those. Those are all potential threats to accountability. Does that make sense? Right. So from this sort of commonsensical view of accountability, these things are sources of lack of accountability. And overwhelmingly, financial market reform, I don't think has been geared at addressing them.
Can I follow up,
Sure, yeah.
Amelia?
Great from my perspective, anyway.
Okay. Okay. Just to follow up, just kind of want to clarify. First of all, I agree with you completely that the net effect of Dodd-Frank has been to concentrate. Um, and it was, but what I'm not sure that is fully understood, at least in my view, is that that was the inevitable consequence.
Yeah.
Every time you have there's a trade-off. There are no policy solutions, there are only policy trade-offs. If you want to make sure that people are acting, that banks, financial entities are acting more responsibly, um, you're going to have to provide that. There have to going to be more rules. More rules means higher barriers to entry. More accountability means higher barriers to entry because people don't want to join these professions. There's there's uh, there's safety in a larger institution than a smaller institution. For all those reasons, more regulation, more protection of the public means more barriers to entry, which I think inevitably means more concentration. So, what am I getting wrong about that?
You're not necessarily getting anything wrong in that level. I mean, I think one of the questions, and then probably let some, I think there's another person with a question. So because I would like to, and I hope you'll indulge me at some point when we've had some break in the summer to having a longer chat about this, you and me, and what you think about these things. But um, there's this, how about I put this? There's this general question in thinking about economic policy that translates very well onto this finance situation, the finance debates, which is that what? You're facing two different sorts of potential threats to freedom. One, concentrations of power, or two, the accountability of those institutions. And sometimes there can be a trade-off to there or a countervailing power. For example, policies that make it easier for workers to unionize and that raise the sort of collective bargaining power of workers can also function to concentrate markets among large economic entities, right? So there's a bit of an inherent tension there as to whether the question is you should break up within republicanism, and I don't mean just philosophical republicanism, with this Republican tradition. There's this tension between, do you want to break up the big entities or do you want to keep the big entities and recognize that you're gonna even maybe encourage them to be the case, but make sure those big entities are counterbalanced by something else, right? And I think in the case of thinking about financial markets, I think if it really is the case that in order to prevent certain sorts of bads from happening and to have the documentation for preventing those bads from happening, that what might be necessary then is to then limit the role of finance in the economy, or to change the role of finance in the economy, or to structure the gains that come from financial markets so that they're more equally shared among other participants in the economy. Keep the big banks, have the big banks do different things. Might be a better answer than breaking them up. That's the short answer. I could give an even longer answer, but you're nodding, so I think I've done a decent enough job to get you there. But it's a great question.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, that was fascinating. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Joshua. We have another question coming from William Bauer. So thank you, William.
Hi, thank you very much, Joshua. Really interesting interview. I love your rich and interdisciplinary answers and exploration of these topics. My question concerns the nature of freedom. I was wondering essentially if the distinction between positive and negative freedom or positive and negative liberty intersects in interesting and useful ways with what you're working on here. If economic freedom can be increased by greater accountability, then what kind of freedom? You mentioned the levels and degrees of freedom or something like that in one of your responses, but could the positive negative freedom distinction helpfully illuminate that? And which, if it does, which of those two are increased or decreased depending upon various kinds of accountability?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, one way you could do it, of course, is you could just make various understandings of accountability or democracy or ability to participate in democracy as one of the central positive freedoms, right? Or one of the senses of human flourishing. It's essentially what happens in the capabilities approach to human development, right? So you take those sorts of things. So in which case, sometimes Republicans think of themselves as offering a fundamentally negative view of freedom, where they're saying like it's just the absence of domination. But those two things can to come together. The positive account of freedom that I think is also a count of freedom, but it doesn't capture what I'm concerned about here, would be to say simply freedom to have a rich menu of financial services to choose from, right? Like I think there's a reason to think of that as a good thing. And certainly economies that haven't developed their financial services to a certain amount, um, people feel less free and they're worse off, right? So it's not like there's a yes or no to financial services, but I do think that one can't understand freedom, right? And again, I offer a kind of pluralist view fundamentally, but one can't understand freedom uh, in the ways that I'm concerned with, in the ways that we've, I think, traded freedom for credit and cheap goods, by thinking about, the access to more credit and cheap goods. So like that sense of positive freedom is not the sense that not because it's not valuable, but because like if you continually trade that sense of positive freedom for these other senses of freedom, whether you think of them as positive or the absence of something, you might find yourself in a bad situation. Does that help? Is that am I answering your question reasonably, Bill? I appreciate
Yes.
you coming out, checking out too.
Yeah, sure. Yes, thank you. There's follow-up questions I could ask, but yeah, definitely want to save time for others, so I definitely appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. I don't know if there are other questions coming from the audience. Lisa, okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I wanted to kind of pick up on some of, what we've been talking about in the Q&A and ask you again about methodology. Do you think this, an effort to make financial institutions more accountable, do you think this needs to be made primarily at the governmental level, or is it something regulators could take on, or could financial
Yeah.
institutions themselves take it on? I'm not sure, given our current structure, say here in the United States, what's the best way to go at it? Is there, is it always, or do you see it taking a particular shape?
Well, okay. So that last part of the question, I'm laughing. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. I'm sort of reading like do you really want a financial institution? Right now, you might think of financial institutions as being a nice check on
Oh, well,
bad.
okay, there's that. Yeah. No, I'm
So like you might think that it might be kind of good to have that check. But yeah, no, I mean, I think it's fundamentally, I think this idea, so like long in the Republican tradition, all the way back to like Richard Preiss in the 18th century. He says, in a great state, um, like freedom, right? So like he's making a distinction between the great state, modern nation states, essentially, and like sort of like Latin or Greek city states or what have you. In a great state, right? For, like the sort of public freedom, this version of Republican for this aspect of Republican freedom depends upon the accountability of institutions. Legislatures are best suited to be accountable, right? So there's all sorts of thorny questions which people reason on, which I think is great. It's not my particular area of expertise, but there's a lot of good stuff out there. Into how much and how to the extent can legislatures delegate to the machinery of government, if you will, these powers. How much should they delegate it to them? How much is consistent with accountability? I mean, I think ideally is the wrong way to put it. I think generally speaking, the more you can have these institutions actually be structured to people who are better, more accountable to the population, the better. That being that, from the perspective of freedom is accountability. Right, right. The public policy is always a question of trade-offs. I think Rob said this, but it's also like the details are the devil's in the details. I certainly think that having an administrative state that has some autonomy also has its virtue. So this may feel like a way of evading the question, but it probably depend on each section. But I think generally speaking, yes, it would be nice. It's useful if people can have a better sense of what's going on, but also what their legislatures can have a better sense of what laws they're passing. There's a more direct line of accountability there. But I think it's also a structural thing that like ceding power And accountability is not something that happens all at once. And when it's been seeded in a certain way and you've gotten down a certain path, it's not entirely clear that the best way to respond is to try and take all that back. And so I don't have a real sort of like easy, well, I mean, I should say, my longer answer is to read the book that I just submitted, but my plan for remaking the government, remaking the economy in wealthy democratic societies, particularly the United States. But until that comes out, and being in the academy, that'll probably be in like 18 to 20 years or so. No, it'll be sooner. But yeah, I mean, I think the things I'm talking about, like it's a question for all of the different levels. But the regulator, at the level of regulator, there are things they can do to do their job as regulators better. But fundamentally, yeah, I mean, I don't know how else to say that other than to say like it depends on each concrete reform decision. But ideally, the legislature should be able to do more, and when they delegate, the delegation should be clear in the accountability of the structure. But the administrative state, has a central role to play, and independent administrative experts. There can be ways they can do their job easier or better, and there are ways that legislators can also make it possible for them to do their job easier or better.
Yeah. Oh, and
That's
listening
not
to
really
you,
much of an answer to your question. In fact, it's a terrible answer, but it's probably an accurate one, which is to say it's a little bit complex, and I don't. There's not an easy answer. Like I definitely want to avoid thinking when you delegate it to the administrative state, somehow you're just giving up on freedom, and that's a bad thing. And you also want to make sure um, that it's not just a matter of where accountability just reduces to expertise and trusting the experts. So there's each question is going to have a bit of a middle ground there.
yeah,
Each
just
debate.
in listening to you talk today, it did seem like it was more of a reform, an economic reform, a political economic reform is needed, in order
Yeah,
to bring us this kind of accountability, which is an accountability to the citizenry, to the citizens, not just, clients of the bank or what have you, but,
exactly. Yeah.
to
That's a
society.
good way of putting it. Yeah. I mean, a lot of some accountability discourse, I think Eric Highlander and other people have written about this, often sort of like the accountability when it's mentioned is often meant like, how do you make sure that one party to the transaction isn't screwing over another party to the transaction?
Right.
Right?
Mhm.
Rather than thinking about the role of these economic institutions, these goods and services in the overall civil society, and how, given that role, can shape all sorts of other things that matter from freedom, justice, and so on and so forth. So that it's more of a holistic question, I guess. Yeah.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Joshua. I don't know if we have other time for the question. Because probably have a question because if I have time, if you have time, Josh. I was particularly interested in reflecting on the two terms of your talk, so freedom and market. I was wondering what is market in the light of freedom, in the sense that I was thinking of the neoclassic tradition, on the neoliberal tradition, where market is a barrier against power, and you have to laissez-faire the market in order to get freedom, and so in that sense, that's not true, of course, according to what we are saying, because power can be concentrated by the market in the market, so the market can be a tool of power, and so you shouldn't laissez-faire the market just because it can limit freedom. And so I was thinking of this way of reflecting on markets in the light of freedom, and if you have something to say about it.
Something I could say about how what I'm arguing for is different than laissez-faire approaches to markets, or I guess
Yeah,
maybe can you summarize the question again? Maybe it's just the end of the term exhaustion and having trouble. I didn't quite catch the upshot.
yeah. I mean, if we mean to provide a different definition of market, what is a market? It's not simply, a place where power is, pushed out, but something that can create power. And so we have to recognize that what is a market is dependent on probably on particular theory we use to approach market and define market, and also financial markets. And so and that has consequences on policies and regulations and also laws that you can put or not on the market.
Right.
And so
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, okay, yeah, I mean, and let me know if I'm actually addressing your question properly. But like, yeah, I mean, there are methodologies, of course, where you could understand markets is a kind of opposition to state power, and that being a good thing, or maybe a kind of check on government power, or to speak more precisely, the power of individual government agents, um, rather than government per se. I think that that's true, for sure. I think, and I certainly, again, let me know if I'm even answering your question. But I think that but markets sort of function overwhelmingly. I mean, there are spontaneous created markets in small scale, but modern markets typically work through governing institutions, right? And so when you're thinking about the institutions that are governing, structuring the markets, defining property rights, saying who gets bailed out first in terms of when there's defaults, saying what counts as property and what doesn't, and for how long, like intellectual property, whether natural resource counts as a property or not. Within those sort of within, all of those questions, and they're infinitely many, and they're ongoing. They're always subject to reform. I mean, when you're asking a question about those questions, right? The questions isn't markets or government. The question is oligarchy or authoritarianism or democracy, right? When the question is who gets to make those decisions, right? The question is fundamentally not between markets and government. It's who's making the decisions. Is it the decisions that are made by people accountable to the mass of people got structured by them, or are they only accountable to a handful of people, or did they just get to decide? Right. So so the markets versus government, is a meaningful in all sorts of different discourses in terms of talking about efficiency, in terms of talking about consumer products, whether you should have a state trying to make a better toaster or something like that. But on this in a way most fundamental question of who gets to set the rules of the games of markets, you can't just say markets set the rules of the games of markets, right? So the question there is fundamentally, authoritarianism or democracy.
okay. Thank you very much, Los.
Yeah, you
And
could.
yeah, my question maybe it wasn't so clear at the beginning because I was reflecting what you were
Well, yeah, I
saying. So
appreciate that. Well, that's the beauty of these things. We can think out loud a little bit, right? Yeah.
yeah, okay. I don't know if there are other questions coming from the audience. Otherwise, I think we can thank once again Josh and Andrew for the rich interview, and stop the interview here. And hope to see you in the next meeting of the Financial Line Seminars and Network.
Thank you. My pleasure. Yeah.